Okay, I think we're ready to start. So, hello everybody. We'll be talking about some CSS basics today. I hope you're ready for some styling inside of your browser. As you already know, we're members of the CroCoder team, where we basically help teams level up their web development skills. My name is Danica. I'll be taking over from David today. I'm a CroCoder mentor and I'm a freelancer. You can check out more about me and my colleagues at CroCoder.dev. In today's agenda, I would like to talk to you a little bit about what CSS, how we can write CSS rules, even though I've been told that you've already written a couple of rules. And we'll also have a hands-on CSS session where we'll try and edit a predefined simple HTML structure. Hopefully you will have fun along the way. So let's get started. As before, all of you, if you want to code in parallel with me, you will need to have any IDE of your choice. I'm using VS Code. You would need to have Git, but if you don't have it, that's all right. I'll show you how you can get the structure regardless of that. And a browser of your choice, I would recommend Google Chrome. So let's get started. What's CSS? So a CSS is language for describing the style of your HTML. Basically, there's a little geeky love sentence that states you are the CSS to my HTML, meaning that both of those are really connected together and that you mostly don't have HTML without CSS today. So if you're using HTML, you will probably have to go and use CSS as well. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, meaning that we're writing basically style sheets that cascade. If you think of the HTML as your structure and JavaScript that you've been starting to use a little bit as a language that defines the behavior of a website, you can think about CSS as a presentation. It's the presentational layer that's going to elaborate on how your structure is going to be displayed. As for the syntax, in CSS we write something that we call rule sets. So basically a set of rules. And each rule consists of both a selector and a declaration block. I've written a simple rule here just to demonstrate what we're talking about. I believe these declarations are something that you've already used. So you've already been able to create something that has a different color or a different background color. So in this case, we see here H1, which corresponds to the HTML element H1. And this is what we call a selector. So it's part of a rule that defines what exactly are we selecting, or in other words, to what element do we want to apply our styles. So this is a very important part of CSS. Everybody usually thinks only in terms of declarations, but selectors can help you achieve a wide range, basically, of selections inside of your HTML. So we'll be talking a little bit about them in this lecture as well. But the other part that I mentioned is the declaration block, which is this part here. So it's basically a block for your declarations. I know. Everything seems so straightforward here. And it really is. It really is. You'll see, we're going to have a lot of fun today. So a declaration block is a block that consists of either one or multiple declarations. You can see here that I've tried with my graph making skills to highlight this line here. So this is one of the two declarations that we have inside of our declaration block. This declaration specifies that we would like this H1 element to have background color red. Each declaration consists of multiple parts, as you can see here. So the one that is in this dark orange color, so the background color, this part we call the property of the declaration. And this one that's in dark purple is the value. Based on some, previous programming knowledge that you guys already have, you know that when we write, usually in property value syntax, we want to make sure that this property that's specified here has the specified value. So we're basically saying, okay, the background color should be red. You also need double dots between the property value. This is how, we know what's property and what's value. And something as a must, you need to have a semicolon at the end of your declaration. So basically, when you're writing multiple declarations, you need to make sure that you have this character as well. So, getting the project. I believe you guys are already aware of those, but let's just get a quick recap. Go to your browser of choice. Like I mentioned, it can be Google Chrome. And then go to our GitHub page. So github.com, CroCoder Dev/Lockdown Learning. You can use the commands that you already know from Git, but if you don't know them, that's perfectly fine as well. You can, clone or download. So if you don't know how to use Git so far, don't worry. You can download the zip and you can try it out. Anyway. So after you download these files that you wanted to retrieve, open the Lockdown Learning inside of the editor of your choice. We'll be focusing on what's happening inside of our folder, CSS Basics, because this is what we will be discussing here. And you'll see that we already have some predefined files just to help us, be quicker in getting with our solution. So, navigate to the folder of your choice, open the terminal or command prompt, and paste the git clone options if you already haven't, and open VS Code. So we've already done that. And now we're ready for our hands-on. Awesome. So like I previously mentioned, we already have some of the files here. I'm going to show you, what they are, so don't worry. We're going to go quickly through them just so you know what you have here and how to a little bit how to navigate through it, all of it, right? So you have an images folder. I prepared some yummy images for you. I think you can already tell that we're making a site that is somehow connected to pancakes. Other than the images folder, you have 2 HTML files that were created beforehand, just so we don't have to think about the structure and writing out our HTML. I tried to paste around some of the comments that what the structure is about. We'll go through them quite quickly, just so you can, easily manage around what's happening. And also, so this is the index HTML file, and also you have recipes HTML file. Apart from that, you'll see two .css files. So they're currently empty and we'll be focusing on working inside of them today. So as you can, kind of imagine, each one of those correspond to the one HTML that's created here, basically. Okay, so now what I would like to do, I would like to show you just how this structure, before we kind of get into it, how this structure looks like inside of our browser when you open it. So what is currently happening here, because as you could probably tell from the looking at this index.css files, we don't have anything here. So we have not written down any CSS whatsoever. So this is just plain CSS that's defined by your browser. I usually do this by right-clicking and then selecting Open Containing Folder, because honestly, I don't know what the exact path is by heart. So one way to do it is to double-click on the file that you want to open. In this case, it's index.html. So as you can see, we have a pretty basic pancake site. This thing here on top is supposed to be our navigation. And the bottom part of the page, bottom content part of the page, is something that is our content, right? So it's basically some titles, text, plus an input and a button and an image. You'll see that we already have some colors defined here, some, positioning, etc. So I want to show you guys just how we're going to see these styles, and basically we can go through the way you can do this directly inside of your browser so you can kind of quickly check these things out. So like you would before, you would right click and select Inspect. This would open up our Google Developer tools. And please let me know, guys, if this is too small for you. I'm just gonna make it a little bit bigger, just so we're easier to see. If you remember, you were probably using console for some of your JavaScript work, but today we will be mostly focusing on this Elements tab here, because what we need to inspect are our HTML elements and the styles that go along with them. So this is the content of our index.html file. This is all the HTML. And as you can see, while I'm hovering over a certain line inside of my Google DevTools, that element is highlighted here. So I just quickly want to show you. You can check this out yourselves if you're trying it out in parallel. You have this first little icon here. It says select an element in a page to inspect it. So this is a really useful tool because you click on it and then you just go around the page and you select it, and it's going to select that element inside of the HTML structure for you. It seems a little, funny when we're using such a small HTML, but trust me, when you have like a bigger project that has a larger structure, it's very useful to be able to kind of navigate and see where you're going and what's going on there. Apart from this side, you have on the right side, hopefully, you have all of these additional tabs, and we're going to be focusing on styles and computed. I'm guessing that you already seen styles, so it's basically a part of your DevTools that's going to show you how styles are applied to your HTML elements. So for instance, we have this image element right here, and we see that there are attribute styles defined that define its width and height to 300 pixels. I specified this just so we don't have large images because they're quite big and would take up your entire screen. And also if you move around, you'll see how this part changes, because depending on the element and the styles that are applied to it, you'll see different text appear here. There's also a computed tab. This tab basically shows us the computed styles of an element, which means if you have multiple styles applied to that element, it will show you the ones that's being applied. So for instance, we have here the color. You're already familiar with the color declaration. And we see that the color is black. If we go click on this little arrow that pops up on hover, the DevTools tool will basically move you to the part in your style that applies that styling to your element, which is really useful if you have like a lot of styles and you're not sure which one is being applied, or you have some weird styling that you need to find out where is it from because you've imported perhaps something from a different component library or someone else's code. This is pretty useful to know as well. And we see here that it says user agent style sheet. So usually some HTML elements have like their predefined styling. If you look at the A element or the link element, you see that, you know, it has a predefined color, it has a predefined text decoration, which is underlined, which is basically the default value for our links, just so we can understand that they are links. So it's providing some visual feedback to our users, but as you can tell, most of the sites don't look like this today, and they have some defined styling. So we'll be checking out how to edit this to look like some web page you would see today. And also one thing to mention, you can edit and play around here. So if I say color, oh, sorry, I have my caps on. So if I say color, okay, you see I have some values and you can directly see how the styles change. So this is pretty cool because it's pretty useful. Sometimes you're not sure which styles to apply, and then without, you know, having to go back and forward with your editor, you can just write down some styles here and then just copy paste them when you're sure the element looks like the way you want it to look like, basically. But bear in mind, don't forget this. This happens to me as well. Please do it one by one, because sometimes it happens to me as well that I'm working on multiple elements at the same time, and then I forget to copy something. And then when I, you know, refresh the page and lose what I've worked on, it can be pretty disappointing. So just try to bear in mind that this is not something permanent. You need to paste it inside of your editor and save it in a file as well. One thing I would also like to point out is this little bottom thing here. So as you can see, as I'm hovering, it's changing the elements, but it basically shows me the structure, the whole parent-child relationship for that element, which can be pretty useful for kind of defining where your element is contained, but it can also be interesting in terms of selectors. And I'll elaborate a little bit more about this later on when we get our hands dirty with CSS. So now that we've taken a look at our DevTools, let's just look at the second page that we have here. So as I previously mentioned, we have two HTMLs. We have index.html and we have recipes.html. So something that's probably new to you guys currently is this linking inside of multiple documents. So I want to quickly show you these elements. So using A elements or link elements, we're able to link to a different page. That page can be a page, you know, inside of our solution, as is in this case. So it's a link to another local file, but you can paste the link to a different website, let's say google.com or something else. So this is something that's probably new, but don't be discouraged. This is just, you know, written down before. You don't have to worry about it. It's just another element that's used for linking among pages. Okay, and the second recipes HTML also contains this navigation that we've seen before. but it also has a title and a subtitle, and has our mock list of pancake recipes. So it has 3 recipes currently, but you can go crazy and add all the recipes you would like to have. I added 3 because I was lazy to copy paste more recipes, but if you would like to have more or something that looks like a full-fledged site, go for it. Okay. And now it's time to take a look at our skeleton. Sorry. Let's get back to the code here. Okay, we'll start with the index.html and we'll see how far we'll go. Obviously, the whole solution is present and will be present on the master at GitHub. But if we don't go to the end of it today, because there's a lot of things that we have to go through, don't worry. You can try it out on your own, or you can check the official solutions on GitHub. Or if you have some issues, you can even contact either me or David about it, and we will help you out on this. I would urge you to try and edit as much as possible by yourself, because that's the best way that you'll learn. With CSS, it's great because you can see it visually, and you can get feedback immediately using DevTools. So this is something that's very interesting. One thing that I would also like to point out is that people tend to avoid CSS for some reason. They don't necessarily like it, but from my experience, it's very, very useful, especially sometimes when you have some solutions that require JavaScript. Sometimes you can, even eliminate JavaScript by just writing CSS rules. So in my opinion, the knowledge of CSS makes you a better web developer and, allows you to do more, such as animation, such as visual feedback to your users. So it's very important. And let's look at our index.html. So as we previously mentioned, it consists of a site navigation, so a nav bar, and 2 links inside of them, and an image that is going to present our logo. Then we have our page content. So we have a wrapper element, and then we place the structure in a way that we have 2 divs, 2 contents. The reason why we have 2 is because I would like to create a site that has text on the left side and image on the right side. So this is what we'll be trying to accomplish. Bear in mind that this solution that we're going to show is not the only solution for this. It's just one of the possible solutions. So don't be afraid if you find some other solution or just go around it a different way. That's perfectly fine. So there's no, usually there's no right way with this. You can do things in multiple ways. So whatever works for you. There are, certain discussions, what could be better in terms of browser support and everything. But that's, someplace that will go after we've mastered this basic usage of CSS. For now, anything you do, it's perfectly fine. Don't worry. And you'll get a hang of it. You'll see. So what I usually do when I'm writing HTML and CSS is I usually place one next to the other, just so I can see what's happening and I can see my structure and my CSS at the same time. Why is this important? It's important because I want to define my selectors, right? And to define selectors, I need to know some things about my HTML structure. So let's start. You can open up these 2 files next to each other in 2 ways. So you can either drag the file index.css next to it, and you'll see that Visual Studio Code will split it. I don't know how well you've seen it, but you can do it that way. Or if drag and dropping does not work for you, you can also right click on index CSS and then you have open to the side. So we can select that one. Okay, so now that we got one next to the other, we are ready to start writing our CSS. The first thing I would like to edit on our page, if you remember, let me just quickly open it up. Oh, it's here. So one thing I would like to edit around, our page first, because we're looking at the index HTML, so you can go ahead and open that one up. I would first of all like to edit the navigation. I would like for it to have, let's say, a different color, different background. So I would like it to be more colorful. For the purpose of this, I selected a few colors before. So I'm gonna copy paste it later on, so you have them. But if you don't use the exact same color values, don't worry, you can use whichever values work for you. So don't worry too much about it. You can just wing it. Okay, so I don't know if you knew, by clicking on this icon, you can kind of toggle it. So you can open it up and close it. I usually like to close it up when I'm programming, just so I have more space, basically. Okay. So first of all, we're going to write the simplest, most possible selector that we can. We're going to write a selector that selects an element of a certain type. So as I mentioned before that I want to edit our navigation, I'm going to write nav. So I now open the declaration block, which I do using these curly characters. I forgot, sorry, my mind blank. Okay, and now what I need to do, I need to write the name of my property. So in this case, we're talking about background color. And I can use whichever value I like. So let us just test, if this works. So you can choose any color you like. If you don't have IntelliSense, that's finishing up your sentences, you can write, white, blue, red. Those are the colors that are supported as text. So let's save it. Don't forget to save. And then let's switch up, which we'll be doing a lot, to our index.html. So we click F5, and then we see that our background color has been changed to a different value, which is great, which is exactly the effect that we initially wanted to achieve. Bear with me, this is gonna look much prettier when we're done with it. But for now, we've managed to edit our nav element. And as you can see, by selecting this nav element, inside of our styles tab, we see our style rule that we've written inside of our CSS file. So we see that the background color is blue-violet. So this is how you can keep in check what you've written down and what's there and what's not there. Okay. Sometimes it can be really, really daunting to use colors, because for the most part, you're gonna have custom colors that are written in hex. So like FFF or some E6, E6. Okay, so that's a different color. So sometimes it's going to be really hard to kind of know them by heart, what you're going to use. So we're going to use something, a concept that you already know of, that's also present in CSS. Just bear in mind that this is not going to work in some older browsers, but that's okay. So how do you define a variable in CSS? So I'm just going to write this root declaration. Just don't give it too much thought. We're defining basically the scope of our variables, and we want it to be everywhere. So let's just use this as is. I wanted to use this because I want to make it more simpler for you guys to use colors. at the moment, but later on we can go into more details. So I would like to define my primary color. So usually when a designer gives you something that's, presenting your site that you're going to develop, he usually gives you a definition of colors that you have to use. And usually you have something called primary. So that's the primary color of your design, which means that it's probably going to be used a lot. So I decided that I want to use this color for our primary color, but you can use whichever color you like. I'm just going to paste it to you inside of the chat so you guys also have it. Okay, now you should be able to use it. And now how can I use this variable? Well, in CSS I write var, so var, and then I write the name of my variable, and that's that. So we've saved our index CSS. Now let's go check if we're done. Okay. So now we see that this element has the value that we specified as the variable, and we see our variable defined right here. So this is a little something that can save you time when you have a lot of colors and you have a lot of elements reusing that color. It makes sense to define it as a variable and just reuse it everywhere you go. And also this is something that's neat because whenever you have something like a theme inside of your application, or you need to change the variable, you can do so quickly. So that's a neat thing that you can do. Okay, auto is not a color. And I've just noticed that I'm not inside of the proper browser, so I'm just gonna fix that. Sorry, everybody. Okay, so this one has quite the large style text, but that's okay. I think it's going to be better for you to see. If there's some issues, please let me know. Okay, so let's continue on. We've defined our navigation to have the background color that we want. We can also define that we want to use some color as well. So background color is the background color of your element, while the color is the color of the text content inside of your element. So let's go ahead and define this as white. So I'm just going to add another variable. It's called white. And the reason why I'm doing this is because sometimes you're going to have colors that are not exactly the same color as the definition inside of the browser. So for instance, white is usually FFF or FFFFF. But sometimes your designer might decide to use a different color, and then it's much easier to just replace that color if it's somewhere defined and not used as FFFF. So just bear that in mind. So you either need to have 3 Fs or 6 Fs. I'm sorry if I'm not speaking that. It's hard to keep track of the number of Fs you say while live coding. Okay, so now we've changed something as well, and we want to go see if that change is happening. So when I select my nav, I see that I have background color and I have color, but I don't have my links specified. And this is because their basic styling was not overwritten. We'll be playing along with that in the future. Just don't worry about it. This is something that we totally expect at this point of our development. We just want to make sure that some of our elements are changed before we do that. Okay. So So now that we have our navigation fixed, I want to talk to you about a little bit about fonts. So I'm not very pleased with the font that we're using currently. I would like to change my font family, font size, and font weight. I want to do this to all of my elements. So I don't want to apply this partially to one element and then, to another element to have something else. So I want every part of my design to have the same font. Sometimes this will not be the case, but currently we want to do so. So one way I can do it, I can write, okay, so the body has, let's say, font size, let's say 16 pixels. Okay, so that's one way to do it. And basically what will happen is that all elements will inherit this font size unless they have something else specified, in which case that other value will override this 16 pixel size. So for now, I'm going to keep it to 16 pixels. I want to make it, regularly sized. So in terms of the boldness of your text, that's called font weight in our CSS. So the property is called font weight, and it can have a lot of values. If you're using VS Code, you can see some of the values that are here. I'm just going to write 400, which should correspond to the default value, but I'm just going to keep it as is for now, just so you know that you can define whether or not you have bold text or light text. And last but not least, I want to define a font family. So a font family is basically a set of fonts with a common design. And with the font family property, you defined a list of prioritized fonts that you would like to have applied to your design, as well as a generic family name that will be applied in the case that the computer or the browser of the client does not have the fonts that were previously defined. So I'm just going to specify the family. So I want a sans serif family. I don't care which font it is. And I should be able to see some differences, right? If I go to my site, pay attention to text on my page. I'm just going to refresh it. And now I'm able to see my changes in my font. So this is applied throughout my site. So everywhere, everything has this value. And you can see that, this value is inherited if you go inside of your styles tab, and you can scroll around a bit and you will see this inherited from body. And then you will see which values are inherited. If you're not sure, we should have one more part, which is computed, but I don't see this inside of this large. I'm sorry, I'm just gonna, okay. It was a bit down. So I'm gonna make the font a little bit larger, but you can see it's computed here. So when you select an element and go to compute it, you should be able to see all of the values that are applied. And as you can see, we had our inherited values as well there. Okay, so I had to scroll. So it's here. So sorry about that. So they're here. So computed basically shows you what's computed for your element. That includes computing all of the selectors, going through all of the possible things that should be applied and calculating which of the things are going to be applied. This includes the inherited ones as well. Okay, so now we're pretty satisfied with ourselves. We've written a couple of rules. So we've written a rule for body. We've written a rule for nav. I would just like to stress out at this point that when you write nav or body, that you're applying these styles to every body and every nav. So our HTML is going to have only one body. But let's say, you write a generic rule for a div. This is going to apply to all of your divs that you have inside of your HTML document. And sometimes you want to do this, for instance, when you're writing a font or changing a color. But sometimes you don't. Sometimes you're going to have some properties that need to apply to certain elements, and then you need to make your selectors more specific. And we're going to show you how to do that. But just bear in mind that every time you write a selector, just think about what exactly are you applying the style to? To what elements are you applying this style to? Okay. I'm just going to show you and paste to you all of my variables that I previously defined. Like I said, you can define some other variables as well, but these were kind of nice for me. So I'm a few characters over. So you're just going to need to put it inside of the root. So I pasted it. I pasted the declaration block. And you can switch these two values with that. So you can go at this quickly. So sometimes when you paste code like this, it's going to go into one line. So what you want to do is format document, and it's basically going to format things for you. So it's going to place things in new lines, which is really nice because now you can see what's happening. So we have a few values. So I have primary dark, light. So usually you're going to have a dark and light version of a color, but basically that is all dependent on your design. Okay, now when I look at my page, I see that, okay, I have a pancake here, I have like the background, but it's not really looking, as any page would. Like I said, I would initially like to place pancakes next to this image here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to define some new style rules. If you're not sure what rule to apply, you can probably apply multiple rules. So don't worry about it if I'm using a different rule than you initially thought of. If your rule works as well, go for it. Just work with it. Okay, so now, like I said, I have content that contains text, and I have an image content, and I would like to place one next to the other. If you can see here, you will notice that I have a few classes applied to two of my div elements. Both of them have the class called content, but one of them has the class text. This is going to be pretty useful because perhaps I would like to define some styling to this element, but not styling to this element. This can be achieved, like I said, in multiple ways. I'm just going to show you one, the easiest example there is. So basically, I first want to display my div next to one another. And I need to apply this to both divs. So I'll just gonna write display, which is basically a property that's gonna define how my div is going to be basically displayed. You have multiple values here. They all have some way of functioning that's specific for them, but I would just like to show you so the block and the inline, how they function. So let's quickly switch up to our console here. And if you check here, you will see that when we refresh the page, we have this rule that's applied. And you see that this rule is happening inside of our script because you have this index.css text written here that displays where this rule is being defined. This is really useful to kind of track where you've written some part of your CSS. So just bear that in mind. And as you can see with the display block, we didn't really change anything. This is because the user agent style sheet, or the default style that's applied to a div element, is basically that it's displayed as a block. This means that each div is basically a block of content that takes out an entire row. If I want to place them next to one another, I can say, okay, you're inline. This means that both of these elements are going to be displayed next to one another inside of the same row. For the purpose of this exercise, I'm going to use display inline block, which is a combination of the two. You can simplifyly look at this as these two elements are like blocks, but they are positioned next to one another. So this is currently the simplest thing to kind of make sure that they are next to one another. Also, I need to write this down because, like I've said, we don't want to lose any of our styles, because it would be a shame that we create such a beautiful web page and then you refresh the page and it's gone. So display inline block, and we're at the same place where we left off inside of our DevTools. Now, usually when you have some content, something that's really important is width and height. This is something I previously mentioned, that I've created these images a bit narrower and with less height than they can maximally be. But we will also define these values for our div here. So what I want to do, I want to say, okay, you have a width of 300 pixels, and you can play around with this value. This is an absolute value. We're not currently using relative values, which would be like a percentage value or something like that, but don't worry about it. We're just starting out with CSS. So with, whatever property and whatever value you play with, it's perfectly fine. So let's again go to our browser. So we added width 300. Let's go to our browser and let's refresh our page. And if we inspect it, we will see that now both of our divs have 300, width of 300. And how do I know this? If you see the little tooltip that goes on top of those elements, you'll see that it states 300 times 140 and 300 times 304. So this is specifying to me what's the width and what's the height. When you look at the width definition, it states that it defines the width of an element's content area. And now we're coming to something that's really important for CSS that, some people sometimes have issue of grasping at first, but don't worry about it. If that happens to you, that's perfectly fine. You can practice a little bit at any of these values. So you'll see, as you get more practice with this, it's going to get better and better. So just don't worry about it. So like I mentioned, the width of an element is content area. The content area is one part of our box model. What this model kind of states and means is that you can look at each HTML element as a content box. So basically a box of content. But also you have some additional interesting values that can help you define your styles. So perhaps you need to define some extra space inside of your element, or some extra space outside of your element. And you would do this using the padding values and using the margin values. So I'm just gonna quickly show you how these values kind of change inside of our browser. You can do it as well with any number that you'd like, it does not matter. For the purpose of this exercise, I'm just gonna give the elements some background colors. A shorthand for writing background color is just background. The difference is that you can, for background color, you can just specify the color, but for background, you can specify like an image or gradient or something like that. Let's place the color, oh, not black, blue violet. Okay. So you see how big is the parent. Now what I want to do, I want to give our little pancakes text container some padding. So how will I select an element? We know that this little tool exists. I'm going to click on it. And then I'm going to select the parent container. So now I've selected it. So it's this div that contains all of our content that's in text form. And now, as I said, I want to add some space inside of it. For you to see it, I'm just going to give the background pink, just so you see how big is my child and how big is my parent. When I specify padding, that means inside of these kind of limits of my HTML, add some space inside of our box model. And you see what happened. You can play around with any number that you want. It's perfectly fine. Like I mentioned, you can even select this text value and then use your arrows to go up and down, which is really useful when you're kind of practicing what value works for you best for your design. So as you can see inside of our little box here, we have the width 300, which is what we specified, and we have the padding 11. And just take a second to notice that this padding is applied to top, right, bottom, and left. So when you specify padding 11, it applies padding to all of these values. You can specify, for instance, padding top. You can say that that's like 40 pixels. And then you'll see that only the top value is set to 40. So just so you know, you can edit each one of these, or you can edit all of them, or you can even, oh, sorry about that. You can even specify using padding both top and bottom to have the same value, as well as left and right. So how would you do this? You would specify the first value, which would represent the top and bottom part. So like, let's say we want them both to have 40 pixels. And then you would say space, and then you would specify left and right, which would, in our case, let's say 20. So you can play around with this. It's really nice to see kind of how these values change. And now I'm just going to show you what difference a margin makes. So we said the padding is kind of placed inside what we would usually think of a box or a container of our element. And margin is something that's outside. Okay. Now we see that this element moved. This is because our parent is like 300 pixels in width. I can specify that it's, greater, so that this element also stays inside. So let's say with, I don't know, 400 pixels. So now it's kind of easier to see what's a margin and what's padding. So you see that padding is kind of part of our element because it's in the same background color. Margin is not. Margin is something that, is keeping the distance from us to another element, in our case, content here. This is very important because sometimes people get confused with these values because, okay, I've specified width 300. Why is this, making my element much larger? Because when you hover over, you will see now that the tooltip over my element specifies 340, and we've specified width 300. So the actual width that's being displayed is 340 because of this box model. And there's one little trick one little property that you can use to change this, which is really useful for layout elements. You can change the property that's called box sizing. Box sizing basically tells the browser how the total width and height of an element is calculated. If I write down box sizing, you'll see it's here. The default one is content box. So as you can see, nothing is changing here. So we currently have the same situation as we had before. But if I specify border box, you'll see now that our element has inside of our tooltip the width of 300. This is because this box sizing border box value specifies to our browser that it needs to recalculate the width, taking into consideration the padding. So this is useful if, for instance, you're creating a layout and you want it to be like 300 pixels and not a pixel more, and you want it to stay inside, then this is what you're going to do to specify this. If there are any questions about this, don't hesitate to ask. This can sometimes be a little bit confusing for people, but I'm pretty sure that you'll get the hang of it. You just need to play around with it a little bit and just take into consideration this box sizing thing. So the default value is content box, and that content box specifies that the width is separate from the padding and the border, which we don't currently have applied here. So the border is basically the border of your element. So the line that separates what is your element and what is not your element. In other words, what is the margin? Okay, now we've had our little play around with our site, and it currently looks awful, but we're going to get there. Don't worry. Usually when people start off with CSS, it gets a little bit intimidating because there are a lot of property values, a lot of properties as well, and they can sometimes have some different behavior than the one that you would expect. So don't worry, you can always check the specification, or you can, try around and play around in the dev tools. You'll get the hang of it. You'll soon be able to kind of get your own little recipes on how to create something in CSS. Okay. So we've used mostly element selectors, which is fine. But like I said, it's problematic because, we'll basically do this to every div inside of our structure. And why is this not good for us at the moment? It's because we have a div that's a wrapper, and we have two divs inside of that wrapper that are content, right? Because if we want to keep these two divs next to each other, we can't have their parent have the same width as they, because this one's 300 and this one's 300. This one needs to be at least 600. Usually because of some calculations, when you have like display inline block and width specified, it's best to kind of give a few pixels extra. Let's just keep it at that at the moment. So now what we would like to say, okay, I don't want any div to be inline block or to have width of 300. I want my divs that have class content. So one way that you can do this is just by writing a class selector. How do we know that something is a class selector? Well, we have a dot in front of the name of the class. So in our case where we have content, we're going to have a dot content. And this is how we defined our class selector. If you were worried about adding some comments inside of CSS, you can do so by using this. I believe this is familiar from JavaScript. And you can write down, for instance, I like to write down some comments about what that part is like, what's it about. So I'm just going to write class selector here, but I would usually write, okay, this is my page content, or class for all of my content, just to indicate what's it about, because sometimes in a few days time you might not be able to remember why you named it content, or you might think of a better naming system for your application. So that's perfectly fine as well. People say that naming is one of the most difficult things in programming. I would agree, especially when you have larger systems. So please bear in mind, just for your sake, that you're able to read something again later on, try and name things as close as possible as you can. For instance, class name A would probably not be a good idea for this. So content. Okay. Now what I want to do is I want to see if this actually worked. So I want to go here. I'm going to refresh so our colors are back to normal, and voila. When you refresh the page, you should see these two elements next to one another, which is what we wanted to accomplish. The only thing is that I would like for it to have like centered text and image. So I want them to be placed in the center of my web page opposed to them being on the left side. Like I said, there are multiple ways to do this. We're going to show one. So I know that since I'm using classes now, I know that my wrapper element has the class wrapper. So anytime, you need to apply some styling to an element, you can just add another class. You can, have them, have as much as possible combinations here, but just bear in mind that, you probably don't need that much classes. At some point, it's really hard to keep track of what's happening. So just bear in mind to keep them, to a minimum as possible. But sometimes if you can't think of something else, just go for it. You'll think of it later. There's nothing wrong with refactoring your code and making it better as you go along. That's something that's something that should be completely normal. Some people don't do that, but you do it. Okay, so now we have a wrapper. I want to give it a little, a large width. Let's say 900 pixels, just because I can. Usually you won't be, using, like I said, these absolute values, but just for our purpose, let's focus only on one screen. I'm just going to refresh and nothing happens. So now you say, why did you do that? For centering, because, if you inspect this element, you'll see that, okay, but your wrapper now, okay, now you can see that your wrapper is 900 pixels wide. And you see that also using the border box. But there's one thing that's really interesting. When you hover up this margin here, you see it popping up. I'm just going to make this a little bit smaller just so you guys can see it. Okay, so you see that this element does in fact have some margin. Even though I did not specify it, because of everything, because it's much shorter than it can be, it has margin. So what I would like to do now is use that information to kind of move this margin around so that's equally split among the left and right. So one way I can do that is by obviously using the margin property, but there's also something called auto. So this property value will do this for you. It will see how much margin you have left, and it will move it to the left and right of your element. And if you refresh your page, you'll see that it's now split. Oh, sorry, we have to select this element first, but you can already see it while trying to select it. So you see that this margin that was, pretty large on the right side is now split between two, and we have our content center, which is exactly what we wanted. So yay for us. If you'd like, you can also place, some fixed value. You can say 100 pixels. That's perfectly fine. But you'll see, that everything else is moved to the right because you specified, okay, left is 100. So this is one little cool recipe that you can usually use on block elements, which fill up the entire row. Specify them some sort of width, and then allow the margin auto to do the rest, to horizontally align these elements to the center. Okay. So now it's starting to look a little bit more like a site, but we got a long way to go. I don't think we're going to finish up everything, that you could do with this solution today, but don't get discouraged. You can, edit around and play around with it. For now, we're just going to keep it as is. One thing I would also like to show you, since we're discussing kind of code and how code can be created. Notice that we have navigation elements inside of our index.html and recipes.html. So this is basically the same, almost the same code. The class, active class style is applied differently. What this means is I'm probably going to have, a lot of CSS that's, both in index.css and both in recipes.css. So what you can do is you can create a new file, and now you can do that by clicking on the folder, right click, write new file. And then you can name it something like base.css or whatever name you like. It's your code. You can do it. And then you can move around this code. So I'm just going to move it to the right side. So one more time, I right-clicked new file and gave that file a new name. That's called base. And now all of the styles that are basically similar from one page to another, I'm going to move to my base class. Base, not class, but base file. Sorry. My mind is in a different place. Okay. So it looks much neater right now, and we don't have duplication of code. One more thing that's really nice with this is that if you decide to change your font size, let's say to 14, you don't have to do it in two places, which can sometimes be hard to track. You can probably put it in a variable, but sometimes you'll have some combinations that you'll want to use. So it makes sense to kind of move it to a file that is going to be used by both. At this moment, if I go back now and refresh my page, I'm going to see something weird happening. I see some of my styles have disappeared. So I don't have my fonts and I don't have my colors. This is because this file here that we created is not included in our HTML. So what do we need to do? We need to add it. If I go to index.html, I already have inside of my head where you place your link elements, I already have one link that specifies index.css. So I'm just going to go copy it, and I'm going to copy it before because I need to have my variable definition. So I'm going to say base.css. I'm just going to change the name because it's in the same folder. It's not moved anywhere else, so I could just use it like that. If I open up my page and refresh, I'm going to see that my styles have gone, back to the way they were. But one cool thing that has happened is that, oh no, it did not happen yet. Why did it not happen? Because I did not add it inside of our recipes HTML. So go ahead and do that. Just copy paste this link ref-base.css inside of your recipes recipes HTML, and then save it and go back to your site to see that it really has the same navigation. So this is cool. We're reusing code. We're allowing our pages to have the same navigation, which is something you usually use to kind of have these basic design elements that define how your page looks like. Okay. Now that we're done with that, I would like to define something else for our base CSS. If you notice here, I have a H1 element, which means heading 1, and I have an H4 element. So I would like to apply some color to those elements. So how would I do that? I could either use the class title for this recipes HTML case, but I want to do this to all of my H1 elements. So this is why I'm just going to write down the selector that defines H1, because I wanted to apply it across all of my styles. So color, and we're going to use one color. I'm going to use primary dark. And I'm going to do the same thing for H4. I'm just going to use the primary color instead of primary dark. You can use whatever color you like. It's perfectly fine. So I write primary. If I save this and I go back to my pages, I see that the colors have changed. You can also open this link by double-clicking open link in new tab just to check, because these are the same, styles that should be applied everywhere. So open it up and you see that these elements have the same colors, meaning that they are either H1 or H4. One thing I would like to stress out, if you would like to, for instance, you were writing your code, you looked at your styling and you've seen that, you would like to keep these things consistent. So you would like to have like H1 and H4 have the same styles. What you can do here is write H1, comma, and then H4. And then write your declaration. What this will do basically, this would apply styling to both H1 and H4. Pay attention to having this because there are some selectors that are written down differently. So if you do not, write down the comma, it will mean something completely different. For instance, if you don't write anything at all, you can also check it out. But this will not do anything because this will look for the H4 element that's placed inside of H1, which we currently inside of our two HTML structures, we do not have. So just to be, sure, always keep in mind what you want to do with your selectors. And don't worry that you don't know a lot of them right now. You're going to learn along the way, the more and more selectors you have. And if I press F5, you'll see that this one changed their color. Okay, so I'm just going to remove it because I'm not going to need it anymore. So basically, one more perhaps important thing that I would like to show you in these last few minutes that we have, because everything else that's inside of the solution is something that you can probably quickly Google and you can decide to do a different way. So it's basically something that you choose either a font size or you choose padding that you want to have. So I'm just going to give you that freedom to decide whatever you want to do. I'm just going to show you quickly a few selectors that you can use to play around with this a little bit more. So we're still going to play inside of our index.html, and we're going to use index.css. So open up that file. We already seen inside of our base, we have element selectors. We've just seen like two selectors being applied at the same time. So like applying the same styles to two different selectors, right? So this one was one thing, but sometimes you want to kind of annotate the child and parent relationship between certain elements. This is something that's very natural for HTML because you have a tree structure. So what I'm going to show you is how you're going to write that. Let's say that we're looking at this structure. Remember, we have a wrapper element, which is a div. We have a div that's also content and text. And then, we have some basic div with content class. Okay. So imagine that we have a situation, this is pretty straightforward, but imagine that we had a situation where, for instance, I had another div that's also somewhere outside of this wrapper, and that it has hello text inside of it, just for the purposes of this exercise. And then let's say I also want to have like text, because okay, this is text. Yeah, I'm just going to give this the text class for whatever reason. Okay. If I switch to my screen, I see it underneath everything on the start of the line. Perfect. Let's say I want to specify that this text should be aligned to the right. There's something that's called a text align, right? So you can specify, okay, I have my text. Yeah, everything's going well. I'm writing my selector. I'm writing my declarations. And then I say text align. And I want to, put them to right. If I go back, I see that my hello has gone to the right. And let's say I don't want that. I don't want, this style applied to every text. I want to apply it to the text that inside of my wrapper and inside of my content. Well, you can do that by using the selector that defines a parent-child relationship. So basically when you write wrapper space dot text, this is going to select only the text that's inside of wrapper. I'm just gonna, use, let's say color blue, just to show what's happening here. Oh, it's not applying. So sometimes you'll see, okay, things are not applying as well as I would like them to. So now I need to check out why is it not applying. And if I go here, I see this crossed out. So sometimes this is going to happen, and you need to be aware that something is overriding a different style. So not all rules are, equally important. So some of them are going to be overwritten. So the easiest way people usually do it is just by adding important. Sometimes it's not going to work. So don't be discouraged. You just need to write a rule that's much more detailed than the one placed before. I can do this if I go to my code. Okay, so I know that I have wrapper and I have to have text inside of wrapper, but I can make it more specific if I say okay. I need to have a descendant because I'm tackling this, but this is directly influenced by a rule in our base. So what I need to do is I need to say, okay, I have a wrapper. Inside of wrapper, I have text. And inside of text, I have h1. So this is just to show you that you can go however deep you want to go. And if I refresh my screen, you'll see that it happens because now I have a more specific rule that's targeting this exact element. Why is it more specific? Well, because it's specifying more elements. It's specifying that I need to have a wrapper class, I need to have a text element class, and then I need to have h1. Bear in mind, you can, combine them as much as possible, so you don't need to only apply class ones. You can apply, div here as well. So just bear in mind that you can do all sorts of things here. And one more thing I would like to point out is that this just means I have a h1 inside of div, inside of a wrapper. I don't care whether they're direct children or not. So if I do this, let's see what's going to happen. So if I use this, I still see that, this rule is being applied because it's a more specific rule. It specifies a parent and specifies a child, and that child specifies color. And now if I say I want to have this applied only to the wrapper that has a child, direct child, h1, I'll see that this is going to stop applying to my element. Oh, sorry. So it was blue before when we had this child, general kind of child selector. So this is also called the descendant selector. So I just care that you're somewhere inside of wrapper. I don't care where you are. And if I refresh, I see that it's the same. So I don't see this rule that I've newly created. And this is because it's not applied. So just bear in mind, just because you don't see the rule, it does not mean it's not inside of your file, that you didn't save. It means that it's not being applied to that element. So why is this not applying to my element? Because this selector specifies that this is a child. So I need to have an H1 that's a direct child of wrapper. So if I had something like this, so I place H1 outside of div content text and I place it directly inside a wrapper, I'm going to see that it's going to be applied again. But all other styles are not applying again because they're applied to the div that had the class child content and text. So for the most part, you'll mostly be, handling either direct element selectors, class selectors, so child or descendant selectors. There are a couple of more selectors, and there's selectors with pseudo elements or attribute selection, but I would not go into that just yet. We can have, more detailed discussions about that or detailed lectures in the future. We're going to stop with programming now because we're going to be mostly out of time. I would like to ask you if you have any questions, anything you want to know. I'm here to help, not just now, but anytime you feel like it. You can contact me on Slack. I'll try and answer as soon as possible. If I'm not, able to answer, David can answer. So either one of us can help you. I urge you to try and play around with the structure, play around with DevTools. They're a really nice tool. And sometimes CSS can really save you saving up on those JavaScript lines. If you're unaware, you can inspect any other site you'd like. So if you see, a style being applied somewhere that you like, you can also open it up and see what they have written there. Bear in mind that if you're looking at a complex site, that might be overwhelming. So what I would recommend is just go here and play around. This little thing here, element.style, is basically the same as you, if you actually written down style here. So you can do inline styles as well. I'm as far as I'm aware, you already know about that. So you can write declarations as well there, and they're going to be applied. That's like the top rule being applied. So even if you have like these color red here, that style applied inline is going to overwrite this style defined inside of your CSS class, because the element style is the most specific thing because it says this element here. I'm waiting just so to see if you have any questions, anything you would like to play around. I have finished both of these pages. Like I said, this is purposely big, just so you can play around with it however you'd like. I can paste the images of one, possible solution, or you can check them out on GitHub. They're already on our development branch, but they're going to be available in the master very soon. So you can, go and check out how one possible solution for this task can look. But also you can play around with your colors, you can play around with your design. You can choose any images that you would like. So I urge you to try and do this, because you can only learn this by practicing. And the more rules you've written, the more combinations you've written, you'll be able to create more and more complex styling. In the future, we can discuss some other properties, such as Flexbox. So Tori says no questions at the moment. I don't know if that should be considered a good or a bad thing. I'll be optimistic and consider it a good thing, that you were able to try everything out, that I wasn't going very fast. Play around with it, try and edit as much as possible. If you need anything, I'm always there. Google is always there as well. I can't tell you how many times did I try to check out why some style is not working, and then I had to read through the documentation and the implementation of a rule and just check all the specifics. So don't worry if that happens to you as well. It happens to people who are even more experienced than you. You are currently beginning, so don't worry about it. It's going to get even better and better. And if you're, so Tori said it's a good thing. I hope everybody else agrees with her. So if you guys have any questions about it, like I said, let us know. If you want to share your designs with us, that's also one thing I would like to see, how you can play around with this. One example project you can do, which might be a good thing if you're a beginner in HTML and CSS, but also considering of starting your own web development career, is writing a simple HTML structure for your profile site, which will basically, showcase, who you are, what have you been working on. So sort of like an online CV. That's always a good thing to have, but it's a nice little project just so you can practice on those HTML and CSS skills. If you don't have any inspiration on what to do, so there are multiple websites where you can kind of check how the designs look like. So some designer firms like to display on Behance what they're doing. You can use Pinterest or any other application just to see what everything looks like. So you can sometimes, at least for me, it's very difficult to think of something from the top of my head, so how something should look like. And people, when they're writing CSS, they get stuck on this because they're not sure what to do. Should I place this color? Should I place that color? It doesn't matter. You can, just take one example that you like and you can try to copy it. Try to do it, on your own. Try and edit it. Try and see how someone else built something. It's a really good exercise, so don't be discouraged if it takes a little bit of time to kind of achieve something interesting. Most of your initial designs are going to look like this, but that's okay. That's perfectly fine, and you're going to go and learn along the way. And probably you're going to go through some of these projects some of these projects after, and you'll see how much you've improved yourself from before. If you don't have ideas, try and copy like GitHub or something, or just open up this solution and try and copy that without looking into what's written inside of the solution. This can also be a good practice to check your Google skills, because as far as everybody thinks, it's easy to Google. It's really not. Sometimes it's very difficult to actually find the thing that you're needing. So keep practicing on that as well. And don't worry, it's going to get better. Don't get discouraged. I'm sure, you're already better than, some people who don't have the will to try and edit things and practice. So you're just going to get better along the way. You need to take these first steps. As far as I can tell, we don't have any more questions. I'm just going to wait a minute or two, and then I'm going to end the stream. Sorry. Okay. I'm guessing that you don't have any other questions. Okay, everybody. Thanks for having me. I'm sorry if I was a little bit not concentrated fully. It's been a long day today, so see you guys all around. Happy coding, and if you need any help, please let me know. Bye.